Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Scott Schell and I'm a specialist in the Germanic languages. I'm an independent scholar formerly associated with the University of California, Berkeley. I have a bachelor's degree in German, a master's degree in linguistics, and a PhD in Germanic linguistics. So welcome again to the Continental Germanic Heathenry channel. Unlike my previous videos, I wanted to go ahead and focus on something a little more unique this time around, namely the Old Saxon Soul-Complex. Now, the Saxons, or really the Germanic people as a whole, had an idea of the soul being more of a pluralistic concept, right, as opposed to a monistic idea. So the idea of like body and soul, or body, mind, soul, is very Abrahamic. That's not really how the Saxons understood the entire complexities of the soul. So I wanted to go ahead and zero in on some of these pluralistic notions. Again, if you read a translation of the Heliand and you try to get a grasp of the soul complex, it's not going to really do you any good. And the reason why is because of translation issues. So for instance, the word for soul in Old Saxon is actually seola. However, another word, gest, is also translated as soul, and the word hugi is translated as soul, and sometimes even the word molt is translated as soul. So as you can see, it's a very challenging task to really try to understand that worldview of the Saxons when you're just reading a translation. But again, this is what I'm here for. I'm going to go ahead and zero in on some of these concepts for you, and hopefully we can get a better understanding of the worldview. So ferah is probably the easiest soul part to discuss. Roughly translated, it means something like life force. It doesn't quite mean life, and it doesn't quite mean blood, but it has that sort of essence, that life essence quality behind it. It does not mean holy breath. That actually does exist in the Heliand as well as heliga adem. However, it still does have this notion of like this consciousness or this sort of life force that is, you know, within a person and within the soul complex. This word actually does exist in Old Norse as well as fjord, and it more or less had the same meaning. We see that, for example, the dead men are filled with fjord, dead men are filled with life, in foluspo, when the seeress tells us about Ragnarok. So, in the Heliand, though, we are told that someone can be full of life, as in ferahas full, or they can actually let that life leave them and therefore die. So it's this idea, like I said, of like this consciousness or life force that is embedded within a person. And going back to my Old Norse sources again, we actually see the word fjornir, which is actually a helmet. And it is literally, a literal translation of that is literally a protector of the fjord, or like protector of the life force. And if we go back to our Saxon sources again, we see that the ferah actually protects the seola. So it's like this this life force that actually, you know, is responsible for concealing the seola, if you will. In fact, we see that when the angels take someone's quote-unquote soul, it's not, in the Heliand, it's not that they take the soul, as in the seola, but they actually take the ferah. And when they take the ferah, only then is it referred to as a seola when it reaches the heavens. So the ferah is, again, that thing that is sort of encasing the seola. And only when the ferah, which protects the seola, reaches heaven or hell, only then really do we even see or hear about the seola. Only actually in the heavens and in hell can the seola even be seen. Hamo by itself does not actually exist in the Heliand. What I've provided to you here is a reconstruction of the word. It does, however, exist in compounds such as leek hamo or feather hamo. And the hamo doesn't necessarily mean body. It really actually means this abstract notion to be able to shape something. And in fact, we actually see that even in the Old Norse sources with the hammer. A lot of these folk tales in the Scandinavian sources talk to us about the hugi, in which case is the shape of the thought that really goes out and is able to carry out a task, really in like this sort of magical context. So, getting back to the hamo, this is literally the shape of the body. The word lik is simply body in Old Saxon, so to say like body doesn't quite make sense. It's the actual, the shape of the lik. The feather hamo is actually placed in a more ethereal context. We are told that when the angels are seen, that they have this sort of feather hamo, this shape of feathers, or this shape of wings, in which case, again, the hamo here is just simply saying that there are feathers or there are wings, but the hamo is that which provides shape. Interestingly enough, too, in Thrymskvida, when Loki has to retrieve Thor's hammer, he goes to Freya and he asks her, "May I borrow your fjallhammer? May I borrow your feather hamo, or your feather hammer," essentially. So it's kind of interesting that we see that exact compound in Old Norse sources as we do in Old Saxon sources. So the gest is often translated as the word soul. However, like I mentioned earlier in this video, hugi is translated as soul, mot is sometimes translated as soul, and of course seola is translated as soul. So there are some differences, though, of course, between the gest and the seola. So first and foremost, the gest is always associated with movement, whereas the seola is not. So the gest can often be seen with phrases such as faran an or an forthwegos, literally like on forth ways, if you will. And so the gest can also be controlled by man, whereas as in humankind, and the seola cannot, again. So unlike the seola, it can actually be affected by transgressions. So again, the seola is this sort of Christian concept where it can be affected by sin, and it also has transcendental qualities. So I wanted to go ahead and give you one example where the gest can actually be affected in this world and actually be controlled by a human being. "The children of men shall call you Saint Peter. Over this stone shall one work my hall, the holy house of God. There his holy household shall gather. Hell's doors may not withstand your strong power. I grant you heaven realm's keys, so that after me you might rule all Christian folk. The gestos of all men shall come to you." So you have an instance where the gest is being able to be controlled by a person in this world in Midgard, but again, the seola cannot. Now, seola is often inappropriately translated as the word soul. In fact, it's directly related to our English word soul. The particular soul part, though, that we're talking about here with the seola is in an unspecified location. We know, for example, that the hugi and the gest and the herta, for example, are all located within the breast. Even mot is located in the breast, but we are never informed of where the seola is located. However, like I described earlier, we do know at least that it is protected by the ferah. As I discussed earlier, the seola cannot be affected by human beings. It is only said to be seen in the realm of heaven and the realm of hell. And so, just to sort of give you a quick explication here, this is pretty much what the seola can and cannot do. So, unlike the gest, the seola can be affected by sin, it cannot die, it can be tempted, and it's ruled by God or Satan. So basically, the way that we talk about the soul today in a sort of Abrahamic context is pretty much how it was used in a Saxon context as well. Let's zoom out real quick so we can talk about that a little bit more, though. So the word soul does exist in every single Germanic language. It's a little bit more complicated with Old Norse because it was borrowed into the Old Norse language via Old English-speaking missionaries. But the original notion of the soul may not have been, this idea of a transcendental, eternal core, but rather something that would be related to the sea or a body of water, if you will. So the proto-Germanic word for this is seola, in which case seola is related to Siwas. So there's a connection there, at least, between the soul and the sea. Now, there are some problems with this connection. In fact, there is really no completely, satisfactory explanation as far as the Proto-Germanic word for the lexeme soul. However, I believe this is the one that's the most plausible. It's the one that's most up to date. I'm familiar with other theories out there too, concerning like S-Mobile and Indo-European discussions. But again, I think this one's probably the one that hits home the most. So we can actually see this word even borrowed into Sami as sephah, in which case is the lake realm of the dead, essentially. And so, given that you have this word for soul, meaning the lake realm of the souls of the dead, in Sami, is kind of interesting as well, because the notion is basically that the Scandinavians gave that word to the Sami, so the Sami borrowed that word. But you may have noticed earlier I said that the word didn't exist in Old Norse sources, and so that's where it gets a little tricky and complicated, because if it didn't exist in Old Norse sources, except for when it was borrowed into the language, then how did the Sami get it? So it's this idea of, maybe at one point in time in like Proto-Scandinavian the word existed, they gave it to the Sami, and then the word fell out of use in later Old Norse sources. But as you can see, it's kind of difficult to deal with. So given that the seola could be related to this lake context, this water context, there is a passage in the Heliand where it's kind of interesting that we hear that the seola can actually be sunk down into the black hell. So it really sounds like, as opposed to like this fiery Mediterranean inferno, right? Which does exist in the Heliand too, but there's juxtaposed imagery everywhere. But the idea, again, that the soul can sink down into the black hell, into this like sort of watery abode, even sounds very similar to the Scandinavian sources when they describe hell, right? As it being this sort of watery, cold place where you're always hungry and you're always thirsty. So there might be a connection there. So if anyone's interested, go ahead and leave a comment below regarding this concept, and I can try to provide, whatever other information that you're looking for. So the soul part mode is actually related to English mood. Again, this is located within the chest next to the gest and the hugi and, those other concepts that I had talked about earlier. Overall, it really represents a person's disposition. Sometimes this word is translated as mind, translated as soul, or thought, or intention even. But, it is the locus of thought and imagination. It can also signify pride or courage. We actually still have that notion today in German with the word Mut. In German we say Mut haben. It means to essentially have courage. But what makes this soul concept, this soul part rather, particularly interesting is that it's really understood as a concept of huger, or like the fylgje sometimes in the Scandinavian literature. So we know this from the noun compounds that exist with mot. In the Heliand, we literally have the word mot yathacht. That's literally mood thought, or the thought of the mood. So it's this soul concept that can have its own will in a way. And you also have to keep the mot in check, right? Otherwise, it can be extremely powerful. And we see this word also in Old High German, but it's not actually mood thought. It's literally mood will. So that's mutwilio. And sometimes this word is also translated as in mot yathacht, as in like mind deeds, or like deeds of the mind in some cases. So the word mot sephjo also exists. This is kind of interesting because you have two soul parts that are sort of integrated into one. You have mod and then you have seභo, which I'm going to get ready to talk about in just a second here. So the mod seභo tells us basically that the mod may have some sort of container to house its own emotions as well. Seභo is yet another part of the Old Saxon Soul-Complex, which is typically translated as heart or mind. But as you can tell, just from our discussion of the previous soul parts, translating that as heart or mind doesn't really do it any justice because we already have words for heart and mind. So more accurately, it's really described as like a container which can house emotions. That's why we had the compound mod seභo just a little bit ago, where it's literally describing the capacities of the mod, right? So I wanted to go ahead and read you an example here, just so you sort of get the idea of how it can house happiness or it can house sorrow and so on and so forth. "Why do you two walk so dejectedly?" he said. "Are your minds, hearts, souls suffering? Is your seභo full of sorrow?" So here again, we can see that it is the container which houses the emotions. So hugi is often translated as like mind or thought or heart, soul, or even intention. It's directly related to Old Norse hugr, and it is yet another part of the soul complex which is located within the breast, next to the herta and next to the gest. It does not have a will of its own like mod though, and it cannot travel, so like the gest can. So it's not quite exactly the same thing as like Old Norse hugr. The phrase mit hlutru hugi is also very common in the Heliand. Essentially, this means for one to act with a clear mind, right? It's used in this context again with the yesidos and drochten, where the followers are acting with a clear mind to be loyal and to not deceive their own drochten. The hugi can also be awakened with wine. So this kind of rings a bell when it comes to the Scandinavian sources again, in the Poetic Edda, when Odin drinks the mead of inspiration and essentially is able to, his mind is awoken, right? The Other is awoken, and he is able then to carry out words and works through this divine inspiration, if you will. So, lastly, the hugi can actually said to well up. I'm going to read you a passage here again where we see this. Then Simon Peter, the bold sword thane, became enraged. His hugi welled up within him in such a way that he couldn't speak a word. So, the hugi, as you can see here, is directly related to the mind. It's directly related to the thought. It's related to intention and really that whole complexity of ideas. So the last part of the soul complex that I wanted to go ahead and talk about is woad. This is actually found in the name Woden or Wotan or Odin, and essentially it means like raging or angry. Now this word does not actually exist in the Heliand as itself, that is as a noun, like it doesn't exist as angry as in woad. What I've provided to you here is just simply a reconstruction. However, it can be found in the word woriendi in the Heliand. That is a present participle of that word, and essentially it just means the raging one. The context in which this is used is kind of interesting. It talks about Satan and his followers basically getting a hold of someone and making him go insane. So again, it's used, the fact that it's used in the context of Satan and his followers, and being used for someone who's actually supposed to go insane and turn away from God, well, that sounds like something that sounds pretty heathen, to me, or at least, it definitely comes off that way in this particular context. And this word was probably intentionally avoided in the Heliand, because of its strong associations with Woden, right? We know that the name Woden exists because of the Old Saxon baptismal vows, which I will talk about soon. And we know that the word exists given the root of the word in the present participle. But again, this is probably something that the author was probably trying to intentionally avoid using. Alright, well, as you can see, ultimately all of our soul parts are located within the breast for the most part. Hopefully this video has helped you quite a bit in terms of understanding this pluralistic idea of the soul and how it wasn't exactly so simple. Right? It wasn't simplified to just everything meaning soul. And, if you have any questions, please post them below. Hopefully this video wasn't too long-winded, but as you can tell, this concept, this idea of the pluralistic, notion of the soul can be, I'll just say, has the capacity to be a little long-winded. So it's a very complicated subject, in the sense that there's much to talk about. So yeah, just go ahead and leave a comment below, like the video, go ahead and subscribe, and please share this one with anyone who would be interested in the idea of the Germanic soul. Take care. I'll see you soon. Ortoris os reda coneva unia agonot isen i pen elhosho tir berga